welcome to our 11th lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about substance-related and addictive disorders, as well as briefly about impulse control disorders at the end, because they share a little bit of overlap in terms of how we think about them and how people's behavior tends to play out. So we're going to begin by saying what are the features of substance-related and addictive disorders. We're going to talk about the effects of all the individual classes of drugs, such as depressants, stimulants, opioids, etc. We'll talk about what are the causes that contribute to substance-related disorders based upon the most recent research. How do we treat substance-related disorders? And then we'll talk a little bit about some things like impulse control disorders like gambling and pyromania, kleptomania, things like that. So ultimately, we're going to cover a lot of ground today. And I will mention that, this is actually an area of significant interest to me because up until my professional career really began, this was my focus. So I studied substance abuse as a master's student overseas. I was studying drug policy. And then at Virginia Tech, I worked with Bob Stevens in his research lab, which was focused pretty exclusively on addiction and substance abuse treatment. So this is an area that I've spent a fair amount of time in, though it's been some time since I focused on it. But I will share any, anecdotal experience I have in the research field or the treatment field as it comes up. So there are different perspectives on what makes something a substance use disorder. Of course, if you're abusing a drug, a psychoactive substance, which is the technical term for what we typically refer to as drugs, then we tend to consider that a use disorder. But of course, we have to define that term abuse and what we mean. What's interesting is that the actual diagnosis of abuse is no longer in the DSM, but essentially utilizing a drug in a way that is harmful or that is maladaptive or continuing to use a drug despite negative consequences is typically how we think about the term of abuse. There are wide-ranging psychological, physiological, behavioral effects of all these various drugs. One drug is very dissimilar to the other, and in fact, some of them, as we'll see, have very opposite mechanisms in how they work. But essentially, if you are utilizing to the extent that it is impairing your functioning and it is incurring significant costs in your life in a variety of forms, be it interpersonal, legal, professional, whatever, we start to consider it an issue and potentially diagnose it as a use disorder. So we do define substance use as different than abuse or dependence. In this case, we're really talking about utilizing moderate amounts of substance in a way that doesn't interfere with functioning. The use of substances to alter our brain chemistry is essentially as old as humanity. There's now plenty of evidence of people utilizing alcohol tens of thousands of years ago, and certainly the case is starting to be made archaeologically for things like cannabis. We know that opium was used, especially in the East extensively long before it was really brought to Western Europe in the middle of around the 15th, 16th century. But this is nothing new. Utilizing substances to alter brain chemistry to create a psychoactive effect is something that's been with humanity for a long time. If you are taking a moderate amount of a substance in a way that doesn't interfere with your functioning, then we don't call that abuse. We don't call it dependence or addiction. We call that substance use. And there are plenty of examples of substance use that we generally regard as not being problematic. First and foremost being, this cup of coffee. Certainly there was a time when tobacco use was so ubiquitous that not everybody smoked, but a lot of people smoked, and they smoked in public places, and that was not even that long ago. You could smoke on planes in the 1970s and maybe 80s, I believe, and certainly Virginia did not institute a smoking ban in bars and restaurants until, a handful of years ago, maybe 10 years ago. So essentially, there are lots of socially acceptable uses of drugs like alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco, and to a lesser extent these days. But there's plenty of ways in which we incorporate substances into our daily lives, and they become sort of a normal thing that's not typically associated with problematic use for many people. For others, we cross that line and start to have problems. If we utilize the term intoxication, what we're basically saying is that the person is having a physical reaction to a substance. For example, feeling drunk or feeling intoxicated on alcohol. So substance intoxication is an acute state associated with the actual use of that drug then and there or recently. When we discuss something as being a substance use disorder, it's when you're using the drug in a way that is dangerous or causes substantial impairment in one way or another. So it's affecting your job, your relationships. I think it's important to remember that this is along a continuum and that you don't cross some magical line from substance use to a substance use disorder. So there's a lot of subjectivity in what constitutes danger, what's causing impairment. And for some people, that's an issue because there's a creep slowly from use to misuse or abuse of a drug. Now, there's a lot of confusing language within this field. So, for example, addiction, right? It's a word we all know, we all utilize. There is no diagnosis of addiction within the DSM these days. In fact, there never really has been a diagnosis that's called addiction. What we typically would associate that with is a concept called substance dependence. And essentially, you're considered to be dependent or in the parlance of the times, addicted to a drug if you have two symptoms in the last year that have interfered with your life or that have caused you significant distress. So again, we are back to that core principle of any diagnosis. Does it cause distress or does it impair functioning? And there is a lot of debate about what that means. We'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. The two basic principles we associate with substance dependence, or what's commonly referred to as addiction, is tolerance and withdrawal. So essentially, if the person is needing more of the substance to get the same effect, or if the effect they are getting from the same amount is reduced, we describe them as being tolerant. So for many drugs, when you're utilizing them, your body responds in a certain way when you're initially utilizing that drug. And then as time goes on, your body sort of adapts to, and in fact, what we're really talking about is your brain chemistry and your neurotransmitter receptors adjust and change and adapt in response to that. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this phenomenon sort of anecdotally amongst heroin users, that they're always chasing that first high. You know, that sort of euphoric effect of the first utilization is something that people often say you never quite have as strong a reaction to after your first few uses of drugs like that. And certainly for people that are, beginning to use alcohol in college or in high school, you notice that people have not yet sort of learned how to behaviorally adapt and respond to alcohol, and it does not take a large amount of those substances to cause a really big response. And over time, though, you do become tolerant to it, and tolerance is very real on a physiological level. I distinctly remember doing my first round of assessments, these what's called a timeline follow back, when I was a researcher at Virginia Tech. We were working out at the VA hospital with people in the substance abuse recovery program. And I remember doing this in-depth assessment where you go back over the last 90 days. It's called a timeline follow back, or a Form 90 for 90 days, where you basically have the person recreate their substance use over the last 90 days. And I remember a guy saying, no, I drink a fifth of vodka every day. And I sort of thought, well, maybe he's being hyperbolic, he's exaggerating. No, this is a guy that had been drinking for decades, and he was literally drinking a fifth of vodka every day and still at least marginally functioning. He was still working. He was doing a lot of things under that heavy influence of alcohol. So tolerance is a very real phenomenon, and it can be quite dangerous in the context of substance dependence, because tolerance goes away to a certain degree when you stop using a drug. And so there's always an issue of people who utilize drugs, they quit, and then they go back to using the same amount they were using, and which essentially can lead to an overdose because they no longer have that tolerance. There's some evidence that this was involved in a lot of high-profile overdoses that you've all heard of. Withdrawal is essentially a related concept, but the idea is that when you withdraw the substance, when you remove the substance from the person's body, there's a physical response when it's discontinued after regular use. So I have a lot of patients within my practice where our providers, our medical providers, are prescribing them opiate pain medication because they're having increasing pain as they get older and their health declines. And a lot of patients will say, well, doc, I'm worried, am I going to get addicted to this medication? And the thing that I always say to them is, well, it depends on what you mean by addiction. If you mean tolerance and withdrawal, then yes, because if I give someone, not I am not a medical provider, but if our team prescribes somebody opiates, they are going to become tolerant to the effects of that opiate over time. They will get less of a response at the same dose, or they're going to require more. And if you take it every day for a certain amount of time and then you immediately stop it, you're going to go through a withdrawal syndrome. What I really want to emphasize with them is, if that's your definition of dependence or addiction, then yes. If you're talking about the fact that it's going to change your behavior, that you're going to do things you would not otherwise think you would do to obtain the drug, or how you're going to feel if someone discusses discontinuing it, I think that that's a different issue. So oftentimes we're confusing physiological dependence, substance dependence, with more of a psychological dependence and all of the sort of behavior changes that come with that. So when we talk about substance dependence, we are generally referring to the physiology. There is some overlap with the idea of increased drug seeking behavior and sort of doing things that are maladaptive to obtain the drug. But I think we're really starting to, cross over into the world of substance abuse at that point. So your book talks about 5 main categories. One more thing I wanted to mention actually from the previous slide, but I'll say it here, is that prior to DSM-5, the DSM-4-TR, the last version before the DSM-5, defined abuse and dependence as separate diagnoses. And in our research, especially back when I was doing research, that was an important distinction, was we had to assess whether or not the person was dependent, but also whether or not they were engaging in abuse. And those were kind of seen as separate issues. DSM-5 has gotten rid of that differentiation and now talks mostly about intoxication versus a use disorder, but we'll get into that in a moment. So these are the 5 major classes of drugs. We're going to talk about depressants, so things that cause behavioral sedation, sometimes referred to as central nervous system depressants. This includes alcohol, sedatives, and what are called anxiolytic or anti-anxiety drugs. So if we use the term antidepressant, that's very straightforward. An anxiolytic drug is a drug that is used to decrease anxiety. So again, we're talking about alcohol, we're talking about the barbiturates, which are much less frequently used than they were in, say, the 50s, 60s. And then mostly the benzodiazepines are the anxiolytic or other sedative tranquilizers, another term you might hear associated with this. They also have an anticonvulsant effect, so sometimes you'll see these drugs referred to as anticonvulsants, which is a separate thing that they do in the body. But the benzodiazepines include things, the older ones are Valium, Librium, those are the brand names for those drugs. Diazepam is the generic name for Valium. The newer ones are Klonopin, aka clonazepam, Xanax, aka alprazolam. So what you're seeing, if you look at every drug has a brand name and a generic name, and the generic name is usually derived at least a little bit from the chemical structure. The brand name is a marketing tool, so there's a lot of jokes out there about how we name medications to try and make them sound more attractive, and people do in the pharmaceutical field. But if you're looking at the generic name of a benzodiazepine and it ends in am, that's usually a good indicator. So alprazolam, diazepam, clonazepam, that's usually a good sign that you're talking about a benzodiazepine. On sort of the opposite end of that spectrum, not entirely opposite, that might be a little bit of a false dichotomy, but drugs that increase or excite the central nervous system that cause stimulation are called stimulants. And these are ones that increase alertness and elevate mood. This includes cocaine, nicotine, caffeine is a stimulant, of course. So that's sort of one major class of drugs. The opiates are a class of analgesic, which is pain relieving medications. So that includes everything like heroin, which of course is, at its very earliest inception was invented by Bayer Medicine and was sold over the counter. Heroin was actually touted by Bayer as a cure for morphine addiction. They were arguing that heroin was a less dangerous version of morphine, which of course now we know is not the case, but it is ironic. You can go back and you can find these old labels from the early 20th century of Bayer heroin, like advertising in magazines and stuff. But heroin, of course, is more of an illicit street drug, and then morphine and codeine are these prescription variations. The two that, of course, all of you are painfully aware of now are the oxycodone, OxyContin. OxyContin is just a slow release version of oxycodone. Vicodin, of course, is well known now, or hydrocodone, and then fentanyl, which is a very powerful pain medication, which has been the new fuel on the fire for the opiate pandemic going on, abuse pandemic in the United States and abroad some places. So we'll talk about the opiates in detail when we get to that. But these are essentially drugs that are painkillers, that act on the pain receptor parts of the brain to reduce pain. They do also produce euphoria in some situations as well. These are all derived essentially from the opium poppy, which is a naturally occurring substance. And some of these drugs are derived from naturally occurring things. Alcohol occurs naturally, though we've introduced processes like distillation, but fermentation is, very natural. There's plenty of entertaining videos on YouTube you can see of like primates and other animals eating fermented fruit and getting intoxicated. Drugs like cocaine and nicotine, of course, are derived from plants. The coca plant and the tobacco plant, respectively. The same is true of the opiates. They are derived from opium, from the opium poppy. Hallucinogens are a different set of drugs that don't really fit into that normal sort of stimulant depressant category, but essentially these are drugs that alter sensory perception. The most common ones, of course, are both synthetic and naturally occurring. So you've got LSD, which is first synthesized in the early 20th century, mid to early 20th century. You've got drugs like what used to be referred to often as designer or club drugs, things like MDMA, ketamine, which is also used in anesthesia, or AKA Special K. There's lots of abbreviations, DMT. There's all these different variations and tweaks of this chemical structure. That also includes some naturally occurring hallucinogens, which are derived from plants. So you've got, or from fungi. So you've got psilocybin, which is, it used to be typically known as magic mushrooms or hallucinogenic mushrooms. So a class of fungi that can cause a hallucinogenic response when eaten or consumed otherwise. And then you have things like mescaline, which or peyote, which is derived from the peyote plant. Mescaline is sort of the drug that's derived from that. So of all of these drugs so far, there are these naturally occurring versions of them. And then there are other drugs of abuse which don't really fit into any of these categories well, things like inhalants, anabolic steroids, and certain other medications. One of the reasons why I emphasize this natural occurrence is that there's a lot of research on how our brains have evolved to respond to substances. It is very odd, for example, and I wanted to make a point here about marijuana or cannabis being listed in hallucinogens. That's also, it kind of stands alone in its own class as far as the chemical structure of the drug and how it works in the brain. It often gets lumped in as a quote unquote mild hallucinogen. But in that vein, there are cannabinoid receptors in our brain. Why? Why have we evolved to have cannabinoid receptors in our brain? Why have we evolved to have opiate receptors in our brain? Well, the general understanding of that is that there are probably naturally occurring neurotransmitters in our brain that are mirrored by substances in the world. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of endorphins. Endorphins were originally called endogenous opioids. They were discovered by the discovery of opium, and how it worked in the brain led us to understand, oh, there are these opioid-specific receptors in the brain. So knowing what we know and how drugs are utilized, and that evolution takes millions of years, how is it that we have these receptors in the brain? And the reason is that these substances which have developed and evolved in the natural world tend to affect pre-existing receptors in the brain, and they tend to mimic naturally occurring chemicals in the brain. So opioids, essentially, when they're in your brain, are acting very similar to those endogenous opioids, those endorphins that are endomorphine is where that term comes from. Originally, you've got these receptors in your brain that the drugs are locking into, but your brain also produces those chemicals in a natural way. And the same seems to be true for a number of drugs that we've discovered. The other thing that's interesting to note about substances is that the effects of many of these drugs seem to mirror the symptoms of various psychological disorders, such as various mood swings, depressants and stimulants, kind of mimicking depression in some cases or mania in others. People that are intensely intoxicated on cocaine act not that different than people that are in the midst of a manic phase sometimes. Um, so what this tells you is that there is an underlying biological process in the brain where there are chemicals that alter our behavior, that alter how we feel, and that through an experimentative process, through a process of trying and testing over time and cultural development, we have discovered these naturally occurring substances that scratch that itch, so to speak, in the brain. But it's really fascinating. Like, for example, paranoia, right? Hallucinations, these things that happen in schizophrenia. Well, a lot of drugs can mimic those through virtue of how they affect neurotransmitters. So I want you to pay attention in this chapter as we talk about that overlap a little bit. So within the DSM-5, as I said, we're no longer using the terms withdrawal, dependence or abuse. We're focusing on substance use disorders, and then there's some specifiers within there to define what's going on. It's essentially a pattern of substance use which is leading to significant impairment and or distress. So we're back to those key principles of a diagnosis. The symptoms, and you need to have 2 of them within the year related to that substance. Taking more of the substance than originally intended. This is kind of the nature of both abuse and dependence. Due to tolerance, then you may be taking more of the drug, but also the abuse factor is you are in an unhealthy fashion pursuing that psychoactive response. If you've had the desire to cut down use but been unable to do so, if you are using excessive amounts of your time using, acquiring, or recovering, that's kind of the trifecta we talk about in substance use research. Is it taking you a long time to simply use the drug, to get the drug, or to recover from use of the drug? Experiencing strong cravings for the substance, so this is a very subjective physiological phenomenon of wanting or feeling that you need the drug. Role disruption, this is your functioning impairment, so you're not being able to perform at work or in your role as a parent or a partner. And then, of course, impact on interpersonal functioning, so interpersonal problems secondary to the substance use. There's a few other symptoms we're going to talk about in the next slide. So this is actually just a copy of that. Sorry about that. But there's some overlap here. I apologize. So again, significant impairment or distress. Is there a reduction of important activities? So not only interpersonal problems and not functioning, but are you pulling away from important responsibilities? Are you using in a physically hazardous situation? So for example, driving while intoxicated, operating heavy machinery at work, that kind of thing. Do you keep using despite the drugs seeming to cause physical or psychological problems? So knowing that you are developing some physical problems or psychological problems as a result of the drug, but continuing to use nonetheless. Now that is really a key aspect of abuse. You understand that the drug is not good for you, that is causing significant problems, and yet you continue to use it. That's sort of at the crux of the ambivalence a lot of people experience regarding addiction is I want to quit. I know this is causing damage in my life, but I can't seem to do so. And then tolerance and withdrawal are the other 2 symptoms. So I apologize for the confusion. This is just a continuation of the list of symptoms from the DSM-5 from the previous slide. So you need 2 or more of those symptoms listed on these 2 slides. So the DSM, again, as I mentioned, has changed. It spells out criteria for substance intoxication, which is simply a diagnosis for being altered based on the medication, or the drug, the substance. So it's specific. So you can talk about alcohol intoxication, stimulant intoxication, that kind of thing. There are substance use disorder diagnoses within the DSM-5, but they are specific to the class of drugs. So you'll see things like, I believe, they do spell out things like cocaine versus all stimulants, but essentially it's just a specifier to say which substance you're talking about. And then there is a set of diagnoses for withdrawal from different types of substances. And oftentimes that withdrawal can take very different forms. So let's talk a little bit about the depressant class drugs, and we'll start with the most ubiquitous of all the depressants, which of course is alcohol. Now, our culture, human beings have a long history with alcohol. I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who would not acknowledge that alcohol causes a great deal of cost and upheaval and problems within our culture, but also it is positively associated with many aspects, especially amongst college students, of course, sports fans, whatever you want to look at. There's people that have sort of built alcohol into those social structures. But it is essentially the psychological and the physiological effects of alcohol that are related to the disorder. It is a central nervous system or CNS depressant. It influences several neurotransmitter systems, but the specific target of alcohol is GABA. So it essentially is inhibitory upon GABA. Now, if you remember from our chapter on anxiety disorders, we talked about GABA being a core neurotransmitter, an overactivity or an overabundance of GABA being associated with increased anxiety. So essentially, alcohol is targeting, it is increasing the inhibitory effect. It's making your neurons worse at firing those neurons that are specific to the neurotransmitter GABA. Now, interestingly enough, there are two other classes of drugs that affect GABA in the very similar fashion. They work on the exact same receptors in the brain, and that's the barbiturates and the benzodiazepines. So I have a lot of patients who are former alcoholics who will say, hey, I'm feeling anxious. Will the doctor prescribe me something like clonazepam or Ativan or whatever, any of these benzodiazepines? I'm quick to inform them, hey, that's up to you to discuss with your medical provider, but you should know you're essentially acting on the same system that you had problems with in the past, secondary to alcohol. So this is sort of the target neurotransmitter associated with central nervous system depressants like alcohol, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. This is just an image sort of showing you the pathway through the body. So alcohol, of course, tends to be ingested orally in most situations. I won't get into some of the less colorful ways or more colorful ways of consuming alcohol, but for the vast majority of people that use alcohol, it's through drinking. So it has a path in the body. You have to ingest it into the stomach. It then goes into the small intestine and gets absorbed into the body and starts to affect various aspects of the brain at that point. It also has significant impact on how our heart and liver function. Of course, cirrhosis or liver damage, liver disease is kind of the most common thing associated with alcohol abuse, but it can actually have a lot of effects on cardiovascular functioning as well. So what are the chronic effects of alcohol use? Well, intoxication first and foremost, right? And many of you, of course, are familiar with alcohol intoxication, but one of the really interesting things about alcohol intoxication is how it is qualitatively different as you increase the amount of alcohol consumed. Let me give you an example. So in alcohol research, we often talk about what are called standard drinks. All right, so a standard drink is a dosage of a certain amount of alcohol in whatever form you're imbibing. So a 12-ounce beer being roughly 5.5% alcohol, which of course there's a lot of variability, but let's just use that as our sort of middle of the road. A 12-ounce beer or one standard can of beer or bottle of beer is considered one standard drink. A 5-ounce glass of wine, because it is a higher ABV, higher proof than beer, is one standard drink, right? Much smaller amount of liquid, but same amount of the actual drug. A 1.5-ounce shot of liquor, of 80 proof liquor, or something that's 40% ethanol, which is kind of standard for most liquor. That is also the equivalent to one standard drink. So as you consume standard drinks, if I drink, or if you drink, 1 to 2, depending on your body weight and your tolerance and all those things, but for the sake of the argument, just stick with the anecdote and stick with the example. So if you imbibe 1 to 2 standard drinks, you might start to notice some mild psychoactive effects. You might have some mild relaxation. You might have some mild flushing in the cheeks. You might feel a little more, a little more gregarious, extroverted, whatever. As you go down the chain and you've now consumed 3, 4, 5 standard drinks, you are having qualitatively different physiological effects. So you might start to experience things like, maybe 5 standard drinks, maybe you're having mild slurring of your words, maybe you're having some balance impairment, maybe you're seeing some disinhibition that you would not have displayed at 1 or 2 alcoholic drinks. As you get to 8, 9, 10, 12 standard drinks, now you're starting to talk about much more significant impairment in functioning. You're starting to see these more gross impacts on the motor system. And of course, ultimately, as you drink more and more, you start to see symptoms like unconsciousness and potentially coma and death. Of course, a lot of students, too many students in the United States in college die every year from essentially alcohol poisoning. And it is surprising how quickly someone can cross a threshold from being okay, under the influence of alcohol, to being in very serious territory as far as your health is concerned. It also can exacerbate an unknown underlying problem with cardiovascular functioning, like an undiagnosed heart defect, or it can trigger, a really catastrophic response as well as you get to those really high levels of alcohol intoxication. So there is also a phenomenon of withdrawal, which is quite strong with alcohol. I'm very quick to remind people about this in my clinical practice. There is essentially one drug that will kill a healthy person in terms of withdrawal, and that is alcohol. People who are withdrawing from heroin may think they're going to die. They may feel like they want to die because it is a bad experience, but it's very typically not fatal. Now, this is putting aside for a moment if you have very serious underlying health issues. That's another issue, that can make this worse or complicate it. But alcohol is generally regarded as the only drug whose withdrawal can kill you. And it is you can go into convulsions, you can have seizures, you can have dangerous electrolyte imbalances that can cause cardiac arrhythmia. So I always tell people, if you are a heavy drinker, and we can split hairs about what that means, but if you're drinking 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 standard drinks a day consistently, chronically, you need to be very careful about stopping drinking abruptly. There is a strong withdrawal syndrome which can be dangerous. There's also a phenomenon called the DTs, or the delirium tremens. This is a very intense psychological response to alcohol withdrawal that can include hallucinations, powerful tremors, and as I said, some potentially fatal reactions to stopping abruptly. There's also the concern of fetal alcohol syndrome. This is problems in the fetus that are related to alcohol use during pregnancy by the mother. So things like impaired growth, cognitive difficulties, and a much higher incidence of behavioral problems like disruptive behaviors and ADHD and things like that. So as I mentioned, there are several long-term physiological impacts of heavy alcohol use. And unfortunately, this kind of takes the similar form to what happens with cigarette smoking. There used to be an ad campaign for an anti-smoking ad campaign where a doctor would sort of hold up a cigarette and they would say, if I told you that if you smoked this cigarette, you'd get lung cancer, would you still smoke it? And of course, the average person says, of course not. But it's sort of death by a million cuts. This idea that it's not one episode of binge drinking that's going to cause these types of health problems, but over time, using in an unhealthy fashion can lead to things like renal or kidney disease. Type 2 diabetes is heavily associated with alcohol use. Cardiovascular illnesses of various forms, especially exacerbating hypertension or causing hypertension. Liver disease, cirrhosis, of course, which I've had several patients on my service who have died of cirrhosis. It is an unpleasant and long process. There are certain dementias that you have an increased risk for, especially vascular dementias with heavy alcohol use. And then there are some very specific neurological syndromes associated with alcohol. So Wernicke's disease or Korsakoff syndrome, they're now sort of lumped together as Wernicke's-Korsakoff's disorder, but it used to be regarded as two separate diseases: confusion, lack of coordination, impaired speech. Korsakoff's in particular can lead to extremely poor short-term memory, very, very bad memory problems. I distinctly remember a patient when I was an intern. My supervisor took me to visit with that patient's provider while he was in the clinic, and they were very familiar with this patient. He was a chronic alcoholic who would drink large amounts of liquor every day, and now had Korsakoff's disease. And he was presenting in the ER, and his doctor come to see him for some symptoms. And my supervisor and this physician were talking in front of this patient in a way that I thought was like slightly insensitive, but of course I was very new to this. And they were talking about possible differential diagnoses for what's going on with him, and some of them were very frightening things that could be potentially fatal. And the patient was very kind of just sort of sanguine and calm about it, and listened and answered questions and then left the room. And I said, hey, wasn't that a little insensitive? And my supervisor explained, I know this patient really well. He has advanced Korsakoff's disease. He will not remember a single thing we just said. There will be no emotional damage associated with this because he retains zero from a conversation like this. So these are some profound effects you can see. Within the medical community, it's sometimes referred to as a wet brain, which is an unfortunate term, but it's this idea that someone who has or someone has pickled their brain is also another sort of derogatory phrase you'll hear. But the idea is this chronic alcohol use has caused pretty widespread neurological damage, and it presents as significant cognitive impairment. So the majority of people that use alcohol are light drinkers or abstainers. Most adults are. So approximately 50% of Americans drink alcohol at all. Binge drinking, which is a moving target as far as an operational definition, but essentially it used to be broken down based on sex, but that was because of differences like typical weight differences. So it used to be for women 4 or more drinks in one sitting was considered binge drinking, and for males 5 or more. Generally speaking, 5 or more is what people refer to as binge drinking. So 24.6, or a quarter of Americans, had engaged in binge drinking in the last month. Now these numbers are quite a bit higher for college students, where there is a significant uptick in the amount of alcohol consumption, and especially drinking to excess. Keeping in mind, I'm sure many of you are looking at that number and saying, oh, well, I guess, yeah, I do engage in binge drinking. You also need to be mindful of the amount that you're consuming and the standard drink transition. So I remember having a patient who told me one time, I'm not binge drinking. I make myself one drink every night. And then you talk to that person about that drink, and it turns out that they are using a 20-ounce glass, and that they are pouring this much vodka in it before adding this much orange juice to it. And so by looking at it, you realize, no, actually that one glass is approaching binge drinking in and of itself, because it contains about 4 standard drinks of vodka at the time. So, drinking things that are higher in alcohol content, malt liquor, and other various forms of, enriched fermented drinks that have 6, 7, 8, 9% alcohol concentrations, as opposed to that typical 5 for beer. And of course, drinking overproof liquor is another way to sort of, push up these numbers quite quickly. So about 16.5 million adults ages 18 or older in the U.S. meet criteria for an alcohol disorder. And amongst adolescents, there's well over 500,000 ages 12 to 17 who also would meet the diagnosis. So alcohol is, I think, by far the most widespread drug of abuse and use within our culture. There are a lot of misconceptions about drug use and race in general. I'm going to touch on a few of them in this. There is a long-standing, let's just call it what it is, inherently racist bias amongst researchers, amongst law enforcement, amongst sociologists, some sociologists, that people of minority ethnicities tend to use drugs and alcohol more than Caucasians, which is actually not true. It's not true of alcohol, and it's actually not true of illicit drugs either. A lot of that, I think, is informed by confirmation bias and by biases in policing and prosecution for illicit drug use. So this is just an example of alcohol use across different ethnicities, and what you'll see is that there's a general trend that holds, which is that current use is the most common phenomenon, binge use the second most common, and then heavy alcohol use is a relatively small minority of alcohol users. So many people, especially when they're younger, adults or teenagers, will consume alcohol in problematic ways, and then eventually change or moderate their use over time. They may stop drinking. They may, as they get older, they may revert to drinking in a much more moderate, reduced phase. But about 20% of people who use alcohol are 20% are able to stop drinking on their own once they've developed an alcohol-related disorder. Dependence does develop over time with alcohol, but the course may be quite variable. The earlier you start drinking, especially at age 11 or earlier in some of the research, the much more higher is your risk for developing chronic or severe alcohol use disorders. So the earlier you begin utilizing alcohol, the more chance you have of developing a problem with it, which is one of the reasons why we have the drinking age, which is another reason why we do a lot of prevention and education for younger people regarding drinking. I think that that is becoming more prominent. This idea of we're not going to be hypocritical and say that this drug is horribly dangerous for everyone and you never should touch it, because you look around and you see all these adults drinking, some of them in very healthy ways, not really causing themselves a lot of problems. The emphasis in prevention programs for younger people now is much more on it is more dangerous for you at this age. You're seeing a lot of that also in the outreach and the public policy regarding cannabis. Cannabis use for adults has some health issues associated with it, but those neurological and cognitive issues and the impact it can have on development are quite strong. So there is plenty of evidence that cannabis is a much more dangerous drug to be utilizing when you're young, when your brain is still developing a lot, than it is when you get older. And that is, of course, true of alcohol as well. The idea that you are quote unquote killing brain cells, that you're damaging development is there's some truth there, as of course. So we also have the issue of disinhibition in alcohol. The idea that alcohol is associated with violence, and of course it is. This is a long-standing human understanding that people that are intoxicated are more prone to violence. But I think it's important to argue that alcohol does not cause violence per se. It increases the likelihood of impulsive behavior, but you don't see a lot of people who are entirely nonviolent in their sober life who suddenly become violent while intoxicated. What you tend to see is that a lowering of the inhibition, and you sort of see a more disinhibited behavior where the person is more likely to act impulsively and therefore in some cases be violent. So in the same family as alcohol, we find the sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytic related disorders, or drugs. So these are the drugs that affect GABA receptors in the brain in a very similar fashion to alcohol, but they tend to be prescription medications of various forms. So these terms are somewhat overlapping, somewhat interchangeable, but let's talk about what each of them means. To call a drug a sedative means that it makes you sedate. It is a calming, tranquilizing effect on people. And the first class of these drugs that really were developed were the barbiturates, things like phenobarbital, pentobarbital. The same way that if you have a PAM ending phonetically, you tend to be talking about a benzodiazepine. If there's an OL sound at the end of, or TOL sound, TOL sound at the end of a drug name, that tends to be a barbiturate. So these were developed in, I believe, the late 40s, early 50s, 60s, and were initially regarded as these very wonderful developments in anti-anxiety and anti-agitation medications, but quickly realized they had a very high abuse potential and had a very high overdose potential as well. They were quite dangerous. Things like Nimbutal were some of the brand names, and there was a phenomenon, of course, that was they were being overprescribed. There's a Rolling Stones song called "Mother's Little Helper," which is about a housewife who's abusing Nimbutal. But the idea was that these drugs were overprescribed for relaxation and dealing with anxiety and stress, and they have an extreme effect of sedation. What's really interesting is that we do still use these drugs. They are very, very, if ever, rarely prescribed anymore for this sort of sedative or calming effect. They are prescribed for a few things, though, effectively. One is they are sometimes used to prevent seizures as an anti-seizure medication. There are other drugs out there that can do that, but without some of the risks, but they have their own side effects. But you do occasionally still see somebody being prescribed a barbiturate to prevent dangerous seizures. They are used in anesthesia quite extensively. So a lot of the medications that are used to put you under for a medical procedure, for some kind of surgery, tend to be barbiturates. And then, unfortunately, they're used to execute people as well. So when you think about the sort of lethal injection mode of state-sponsored execution, what you're talking about is often a cocktail that involves a heavy dose of a barbiturate, which is really the drug that tends to kill you. So they've kind of fallen out of favor outside of a few areas in which they're still utilized. The hypnotics, by definition, are drugs that are sleep inducing, and there were several sleep aids that were prescription that were essentially in this class of medications. Ambien is sort of a variable in here. It's not a true benzodiazepine, but it's very similar. But we've kind of moved away from utilizing these drugs as sleep inducers because they can have some impact on the quality of your sleep in a negative way, and they have a very high abuse and dependence profile associated with them. And then the third class is, again, these drugs can overlap in terms of the chemical structure, but in terms of what they do or how they're described, the third is the anxiolytic or anxiety-reducing drugs, which tend to be the benzodiazepines. So if you remember, I said these are things like diazepam, which is also called Valium, Librium. These are the early developments, and then later you had things like clonazepam, which is also known as Xanax, and alprazolam, which is known as Xanax, clonazepam, which is brand name is Klonopin. So for every drug, there's a marketing name, a brand name that's sort of thought up by the pharmaceutical company, and then there is a generic or chemical name. If a drug ends in an AM sound, it tends to be a benzodiazepine. But these drugs in generally, as I said, they have a tranquilizing effect. They affect the GABA receptors in the brain that are also targeted by alcohol. And they tend to have a different abuse profile. They are more likely to be abused by women than men. They are much more common amongst Caucasians than other ethnicities, and they tend to be older people who are abusing. When I say older, 35 plus, older than the abuse associated with alcohol is what that means, older in that sense. Being 45 myself, I don't want to think of 35 as older, but basically the idea is that there's a different abuse sort of profile associated with these drugs than with some others, and it tends to be demographic in this fashion. So as I said, the effects are similar to large doses of alcohol, and they can be very synergistic and dangerously combined. They can have multiplicative effects when combined with alcohol. So that's why if you're prescribed any of these medications, there's going to be a warning on the label that says, do not drink alcohol while utilizing this medication. That is to be taken seriously. It is very easy to overdose, potentially to a lethal degree, on alcohol when combining it with drugs that have a similar effect. In a sense, what you're doing is you're hammering the same neurotransmitter sites in the brain from multiple angles. And as I said, it's not just additive. In some cases, it is multiplicative. They can really amplify one another. So the DSM criteria for this class of disorders is the same as it is for most other substances. So you talk about use leading to significant interference in your functioning or distress, and an accompaniment of problems like not being as active or effective in your job, your work, your school, your relationships, and developing tolerance to the drug. So needing more of the drug to get the same effect, taking higher dosages of the drug to get the same effect. So let's shift gears here and talk about the sort of arguably the opposite. I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification to refer to the stimulants as the opposite of the central nervous system depressants, but these are, interestingly enough, the most widely consumed drugs in the United States, mostly because of coffee, all right? So caffeine, very widely consumed. Nicotine becoming less so, but still widely consumed, especially in other parts of the world now. The United States is declining in nicotine use, but it is still a significant issue. These drugs increase alertness, they increase energy. This includes amphetamines, cocaine, nicotine, and caffeine. We often sort of draw a very sharp distinction between nicotine and caffeine because of their legality versus amphetamines and cocaine. There are, of course, certainly prescription amphetamines. ADHD is often treated with drugs that are, either analogs like Ritalin. Now, Ritalin actually has a structure somewhat similar to cocaine in the brain and how it affects neurotransmitters. Was an unexpected side effect of Ritalin's abuse potential that I think was not really considered. And then, of course, amphetamines. So Adderall, for example, is the brand name, but when you go and get a prescription for Adderall and you ask for the generic, it's going to say D-amphetamine. It is simply a straight amphetamine. These drugs work on a few different neurotransmitters in the brain, but they tend to focus on dopamine. Um, there is a very similar criteria for stimulant intoxication and use disorder as there are for other substances, but really when you start to see significant impairment in your functioning or psychological changes, there's also some very serious health changes that come with these drugs being abused. Changes in your heart rate, blood pressure, dilated pupils, weight loss, and lack of appetite, of course, is a very strong side effect of stimulant use. Vomiting, weakness, chills. So these are all sort of things associated with stimulant intoxication. Generally speaking, amphetamines, at least in moderate doses, produce elation, vigor, they reduce fatigue, and then this is usually followed by a rebound effect. So as the drug goes away in the system, you have this sort of like a rubber band being stretched out. It comes back to its original form, sometimes even more so. It's sort of the intensified rebound, and you see things like extreme exhaustion or fatigue and or depression. Um, Amphetamines stimulate the central nervous system by enhancing, as I said, dopamine and norepinephrine, and then blocking reuptake at most sites. So the idea is just intensifying, increasing the amount of norepinephrine and dopamine at various sites in the brain. This idea about reducing fatigue is really interesting. So when I was in undergrad, I was talking to my dad one time about the research that I was interested in, and I said, hey, there's a whole world of research to be done on abuse of ADHD drugs because there's a lot of people that I know that are abusing Ritalin and Adderall to study, but also as recreational drugs. And my dad was sort of very naive and said, "Oh gosh, that's really horrible." And I said, was anything like that going on when you were in college? And he was in college in the mid to late 60s, and my dad was very, kind of naive and from a small town in Mississippi, and he said, "Oh no, I don't think so. Oh well, there were those pills we got from the nurse, when we were doing midterms or working on a final project." And more explanation turns out this was Benzedrine, which is essentially an amphetamine. That they were using to study. And so there's a long history of amphetamines being abused for needing to stay up, needing to focus. During World War II, we used to give Benzedrine to bomber crews, to infantry units. There is a really excellent book called Blitzed, which is about how the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe in Nazi Germany were driven, had some of the Blitzkrieg attacks that went on for days on end without stopping, and involved covering large amounts of land all at once. This was sort of a new style of war in World War II. Well, we now know that there were a lot of people in those armies utilizing some contemporary forms of methamphetamine. So the idea that there was drugs have often been utilized in war zones for a variety of reasons, including amphetamines, to keep people awake and to keep them focused. As I said, some ADHD drugs are mild stimulants. I would take issue with mild in this sentence. Ritalin is a stimulant that mimics some of the activities of cocaine in the brain. Adderall is absolutely not a mild stimulant. It's amphetamine. It's D-amphetamine, which refers to the chemical structure. There are two mirror image versions of the molecule we associate with standard amphetamine, D and L amphetamine. They are chemically identical. They're just mirror images of one another and have very similar effects. Cocaine, of course, is a well-known stimulant. Methamphetamine has become more prominent and caused a lot of problems socioculturally in the last couple decades, but has been around for, like I said, quite some time. Was originally, I believe, developed in Europe in the 20s and 30s. Ecstasy or MDMA is a drug that doesn't really fit cleanly into the categories associated. It does have some amphetamine effects and how it affects the brain, but it is also kind of shares some characteristics with hallucinogens, of course, which is why it's sort of generally regarded as a club drug. Crystal meth, which is also methamphetamine. This is they're making a distinction here. It is a purified form of amphetamine with much more intensified blood concentrations and effects. It can cause significant aggressive tendencies in addition to the high, and has extremely high risks for dependence. Methamphetamine or crystal meth is very addictive. It also tends to be an extremely contaminated drug when consumed. based on illicit access. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the show Breaking Bad. And one of the sort of emphases of that show was that Walter White was producing very pure methamphetamine, whereas a lot of the drugs that were being found on the street had a lot of impurities, were produced in ways where they have a lot of toxins and poisons in them, as well as the drug itself, which is quite dangerous. So this has always been an issue with drugs that are sort of made illicitly and have no oversight in terms of how they're, no quality control, so to speak, in how they're produced. So cocaine, like I said, has been used for thousands of years in its sort of biological form of the coca leaf, which is not the same thing as cocaine. There is definitely a chemical process that coca leaves undergo to become cocaine. But the coca leaf itself, the underlying substance, has been utilized, as I said, for a very long time, especially in Central and South America, as a mild stimulant, the same way people have traditionally used things like tobacco or caffeine. But when you process the coca leaf utilizing some other chemicals, you produce cocaine, which is a synthetic form of that, a concentrated synthetic form of that substance you find in the coca leaf. Short-lived sensations of elation, vigor, reduced fatigue, so those things we kind of associate with amphetamines as well. It basically results from blocking the reuptake of dopamine. It's increasing dopamine. And if you remember from an earlier lecture, dopamine is a very strongly associated chemical with reward, with positive feeling. It is highly addictive, but addiction tends to develop slowly with cocaine. 1.5 million Americans these days report use in the US each year of cocaine. There was a much larger problem, not that it is no longer a problem, but cocaine, both in powdered form and then crack cocaine, was an epidemic in the United States, especially in the 80s and 90s, 70s as well. And so it is a drug that has a lot of sociological impact that is hard to measure, not just in terms of the abuse, but how it's affected societies, how it's affected legal systems. Like I said, I've mentioned before, I studied drug policy and the evolution of US and Dutch drug policy, kind of comparing and contrasting them for my master's thesis prior to coming to Virginia Tech. We could spend more than one lecture talking about sort of the sociological history of that issue, but crack cocaine and cocaine in general play a huge role in the quote unquote drug problem and the deterrence approach to policing drug abuse within the United States over the last several decades. Most people utilizing cocaine sort of cycle through patterns of tolerance and withdrawal. So there's very few users of cocaine that are using cocaine every single day. There certainly are, but it tends to be more of a binge-associated drug for many people. And withdrawal of cocaine is characterized by apathy and boredom and a very increased craving to then go use that drug again to avoid that withdrawal syndrome. And that's something we should maybe sit with for a moment. A lot of the drugs that we're going to talk about have a withdrawal pattern, and the way that reinforces dependence on the drug is I don't want to feel this aversive feeling, therefore I'm going to use more of the drug to avoid that. So that's really the feedback loop you can get into that only serves to reinforce addiction. There are some issues associated with race as far as use of cocaine. We know that cocaine use, there was a time when it was more prevalent in African American sort of cultures within the United States and certain cities, certain states, and we know that there is an increased amount of hospital room admissions, emergency room admissions associated with Black or African American individuals in the U.S. Whites making up 37% and Hispanic individuals about 10%. Men are twice as likely as women to be in the emergency room for cocaine use, and approximately 17% of cocaine users have also used cocaine in its crack cocaine form. As I said, there is a very long story to be told about how crack cocaine especially was treated and how it was sort of spread across the country, and how there were a lot of, unfortunately, inherently racist laws enacted to target people who are utilizing crack cocaine versus powder users of cocaine, and much of that was driven by racism. But there's just some differences across different ethnicities associated with the drug. So relapse rates for these drugs, it's interestingly enough, you can see that after people quit um, alcohol, heroin, and nicotine, there's this tendency of everybody to sort of the plateau out. So quitting for brief periods of time, you tend to see very high success rates of people that are remaining abstinent. But as time goes on, you start to see very similar relapse rates for alcohol, heroin, and nicotine. But the basic idea here is that people will often say, cigarettes are more addictive than any other drug. Well, there's some evidence here to support that. Those are subjective, ideas of which is more addictive, but certainly the ability to quit a drug might be a good indicator of how addictive it is. And in this case, we know that nicotine, heroin, and alcohol all sort of follow this same pattern, which is that it is relatively easy, and I'm using that term very loosely, to quit and abstain from a drug for a brief period of time, but that many people tend to lapse back into use as time goes on. And that's sort of the nature of the problem with substance use treatment, is that it's not hard to get somebody clean briefly, short term. It is very hard to help people to stay clean long term if that's what they want to do. So nicotine is a central nervous system stimulant, but it acts a little bit differently in the brain than things like cocaine or amphetamine. It affects a neurotransmitter that's very prevalent throughout the brain called acetylcholine. It results in sensations of relaxation, wellness, and pleasure. Many people who smoke will tell you, ironically enough, even though it's a central nervous system stimulant, it makes them feel calm and relaxed. Nicotine is highly addictive, and as I said, relapse rates are equal to those seen with things like alcohol and heroin. So in terms of the nicotine-related disorders amongst the stimulants, what's generally happening with someone who's a chronic smoker is that they are dosing themselves consistently over time to maintain a steady state of nicotine. You're going through a complex relationship to essentially avoid withdrawal syndrome in quite a rapid succession, because nicotine is processed very quickly within the body. People who smoke will generally say that they or who use nicotine in other forms like vaping will say that it improves their mood in the short term, but depression is more common in those with nicotine dependence, and we can split those hairs and decide if that's a causal relationship or in which direction the arrows are in that causal relationship, but we do know that it's related to negative affect in a number of ways. So the DSM-5, like I mentioned, talks about things like intoxication and use disorders. It also talks about withdrawal. So after several weeks of daily use of nicotine in one form or another, unpleasant symptoms tend to occur upon stopping or reducing. And this can be everything from insomnia, increased appetite, feeling restless, trouble concentrating, anxiety, depression, irritability. And these symptoms tend to lead, at least in the short term, to clinically significant distress or impairment. One thing that I often emphasize with patients that are trying to quit smoking is that this process is relatively brief. Within 72 hours, there is no nicotine left in your system. So any physiological craving that or withdrawal process that you're going through is over within a window of about 3 days. Beyond that, it's really much more about psychological and behavioral dependence than it is physiological, which is why I know there's some success. I'm a little skeptical of nicotine replacement treatments as a long-term way of quitting, but for some people, that's what it takes to get them over the hump. I think they are most effectively used when they're essentially used in a taper method, where you try to sort of match close to your nicotine dosage that you were getting from smoking or vaping, and then eventually reduce it slowly and titrate it out of your system. But ultimately, you're not really addressing the behavioral and psychological dependence through nicotine replacement treatments. But for some people, it's the thing that gets them over the hump and allows them to quit. So caffeine, generally regarded as the quote-unquote gentle stimulant. Over 85% of Americans utilize caffeine in one form or another. So you find it in tea, coffee, Cokes, cola drinks, and to a lesser degree in chocolate and cocoa products. Small doses of caffeine elevate mood, reduce fatigue. We've been using caffeine in one form or another for a very long time as human beings. But regular use can result in tolerance and dependence. Caffeine is blocking the reuptake of a different neurotransmitter in the brain called adenosine or adenosine. So the idea here is that it is still a stimulant, but not in the same way that things like cocaine and amphetamine or nicotine are stimulants. Interestingly enough, I can tell you a little anecdote. My father worked basically his entire career for as a civil engineer, and he would when he retired, we all were kind of concerned about him because he was very type A and he loved his job and he worked very hard. And we're like, how's he going to adjust to retirement? As it turns out, quite well. But one thing he noticed right away was he said, I started getting headaches every day in the afternoon after I quit working. What we didn't understand initially was that he was working in sort of an old school environment where there was always a pot of coffee on in the office. And when he kind of crunched the numbers and looked at it, he was drinking, in the neighborhood of 6 to 8, sometimes more than that, cups of coffee a day. And by quitting work, he was still drinking his coffee in the morning as a routine, but then he wasn't drinking throughout the day, and he was going through a withdrawal syndrome associated with caffeine. Just didn't quite realize it at the time. So there are some negative effects associated with caffeine. Of course, it can exacerbate some things like hypertension, high blood pressure, and a few other physiological effects. It can have some negative gastrointestinal effects on some people, but it is an extremely widespread, drug of choice for many people. There is a DSM-5 criteria for caffeine intoxication, and this is usually associated with excess intake of caffeine. For any of you that have ever, had a triple shot of espresso or something, you'll be familiar sometimes with this feeling, unless you're already tolerant to that much caffeine. So if you consume caffeine in excess or significantly enough, you'll get some physical symptoms like feeling jumpy or restless, some anxiety, insomnia, some flushed face. That's due to vasodilation, I believe, diuresis, GI disturbance, muscle twitching, rambling thoughts or speech, elevated heart rate, tachycardia, that is. Excitement, inexhaustibility, and motor agitation. So these symptoms, we think of it as a safe drug in many cases, or of the mild stimulant, but it can have some clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning when it's being abused. One of the things that's kind of exacerbated this problem, I think, is the widespread use of energy drinks, which often can have very high doses of caffeine. They can also have a lot of other substances in them that can increase some of these effects. So it's become sort of a new player in the world of, caffeine intoxication. People are drinking these sort of, things like Red Bull and other similar drinks, not realizing the actual extreme amounts of caffeine they're consuming in the process. Let's shift here and talk about the opioids for a minute. So as I mentioned before, the opioids are basically all drugs that are derived from the opium poppy and what were traditionally called narcotic effects. The word narcotic is a little problematic because it has been misapplied, and so there is kind of especially in law enforcement, or in the legal system, there's a tendency to refer to all illicit drugs as narcotics, but literally narcotics is a direct reference to opioids. So the natural and synthetic substances that we get from the poppy are called opioids or opiates. These are used relatively interchangeably. Heroin is a form of opiate that's processed and is used by about 500,000 people in the U.S. every year. As I mentioned, originally developed by Bayer Pharmaceutical in Germany, marketed as a cure for morphine addiction, which was becoming a problem in the early 20th century. There were a lot of what are called patent medicines, which were these sort of over-the-counter drugs, like, for example, laudanum was a mix of alcohol and opiates. And morphine, but the idea being that these drugs, there was a time when most of them were illegal, but there's a long human history of the relationship to the opium poppy. It is one of the first, originally derived forms of pain management and analgesia for people that were undergoing significant pain. What we've seen, and I won't get too much into this, again, there's a lot of things in this class, unfortunately, that we have to breeze over, but there is a major opiate abuse epidemic in the United States right now, which I'm sure many of you are all aware of. There's a long and sordid history of how we got there, but let me give you the very quick version of this. You go back 20 years ago or so, and doctors were basically trained that opiates are only to be used in very specific extreme circumstances. So you used opiates in hospice and palliative care. People that were dying relatively soon, that had poor prognosis, have always used things like morphine and other drugs. for a variety of positive effects, not just pain killing, but reducing dyspnea or shortness of breath. But there was basically a training that you only use them in extreme circumstances and you only use them acutely. They were not drugs to be given chronically to people because they were so dangerous. Then comes along Sackler Pharmaceutical and the Sackler family or Purdue Pharmaceutical and some other, primary offenders here in this issue who developed these new forms of opiate medications, which are, of course, copyrighted. They cannot be sold as generics yet. So there's a lot of money to be made and a widespread marketing push of physicians to utilize these medications. They were sold a lot of misinformation about how they were not as dangerous and how they had lower abuse potentials. And essentially what you saw was a whole generation of physicians which were starting to prescribe opiates again for chronic pain and for a variety of issues. And so the pendulum swung very far to the right, and suddenly you have lots of Americans being prescribed, and not just in the United States, but especially in the United States, lots of Americans being prescribed these opiate pain medications and immediately developing pretty serious substance use problems associated with them. Most especially because a lot of people were dying from overdoses of these drugs. So then we suddenly have this sort of social constructive system goes into effect, and now we have an opiate problem, a self-created one, but nevertheless an opiate problem. And what happens is the pendulum swings back the other way. Some people in white coats actually start going to jail, which is not very common. And you see these sort of pill mills being shut down by the DEA and the FDA, and a pushback against this. And what happened as a result was the spigot was turned off for a lot of people who are now significantly addicted to opiates that were getting these prescription, either licitly or illicitly, they were getting these prescription medications, and they became harder to find. They became much more expensive in terms of street value. OxyContins were selling, for $50, $100 a piece in some places when this happened. So, the natural supply and demand market was going into effect. What happened was heroin, an illicit drug not produced by the pharmaceutical companies, became a cheaper and more readily available alternative for all of these opiate addicts. And next thing you know, we have now a secondary heroin epidemic that comes along on the heels of them reversing course on how opiates are being prescribed. So that's the very short version of what's going on. But we have a very serious problem in this country with opiate addiction and opiate abuse. It's rising. Over 4 million people over the age of 12 report non-medical abuse of these drugs. And as I mentioned, these are originally developed as painkillers and prescribed as such, but they've become a really serious problem, and they have an extremely high both abuse potential and risk of overdose. So, as I mentioned, there are these endogenous opioids in the body, the enkephalins, the endorphins, and opioids simply lock into these same receptors and affect the brain in that fashion. So low doses of opioids induce euphoria, drowsiness, and slowed respiration, which is why we use them extensively in hospice for people that have cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease, who are having a hard time breathing. Giving someone a low dose of, for example, Roxanol, which is liquid morphine, is very common in hospice to help people feel less what they call air hunger. So to reduce that sense, this is not to kill the person or reduce their respiration to the point that they die. It really is a therapeutic effect that we use all the time in hospice and palliative care at low doses. High doses, of course, though, can suppress respiration to an extent that it is quite dangerous and can kill you. Withdrawal symptoms from opioids can be lasting and quite severe, but tend to resolve within roughly 72 hours. As I mentioned, mortality rates are very high for opioid addicts. There's also an extremely high risk of HIV infection due to the sharing of needles for those that are using these drugs intravenously. Another issue to consider that I mentioned earlier is this idea of tolerance. And what happens for a lot of people is that they will abuse opiates, especially intravenously. They'll abuse opiates. They quit. They may go through a rehab. They may quit of their own accord. And then they relapse and they go back to their same dosage that they are now no longer tolerant to, which then unfortunately often results in an overdose and sometimes in death. So your body has compensated back to a relatively normal reactivity to opiates, but the individual does not understand or know that. and therefore says, well, back when I was using, I would take this many milligrams of OxyContin, for example, or this much heroin, and as a result, they end up killing themselves when they relapse. Let's talk a little bit about cannabis-related disorders. So part of my research, both at Virginia Tech and my master's thesis, was focused on policies and treatment of cannabis-related disorders. As I mentioned, marijuana. Let's get the terminology straight for a minute. So cannabis is generally a reference to the plant itself. Hemp is the actual, the hemp plant is part of this terminology as well. There's been a shift. Marijuana generally refers to the actual the form of the drug that's utilized. So the buds of the plant that are then dried and often smoked, or now in the modern era often are sort of processed into other things like edibles and that kind of thing as well, or oils. But the idea is that the plant substance itself that is psychoactive, that is consumed in a variety of forms, is usually referred to as marijuana. Cannabis is more of a medical research term to refer to it, but it's all in reference to the same thing. There is now some archaeological evidence of human beings using cannabis going back if at least 10, if not 20, 30,000 years. And this is just what we've discovered in the archaeological record. It is considered a mild hallucinogen, but I feel like that's a bit of a misnomer. We'll talk about that in a moment. It is the most frequently used illegal drug. 2.5 million people or so have used cannabis in the last 30 days in the United States. The cannabis, unlike say an opiate or alcohol, cannabis is an extremely complex molecule. Which is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of research on deriving various aspects of the plant and utilizing them for their medicinal qualities, like CBD. We're seeing a lot of people using CBD for musculoskeletal pain, for sleep. So this is one of the non-psychoactive aspects of the hemp plant. The substances within cannabis are extremely diverse, and that we don't fully understand them. We have not fully mapped the molecule because it is so complex. But what we do know is that tetrahydrocannabinol 9, THC or THC9, is one of the primary psychoactive ingredients in cannabis that causes the effects that people generally are using to induce. There's, interestingly enough, some legal loopholes where right now delta tetrahydrocannabinol 8, which is very slightly different chemical within the cannabis plant, is still technically legal in a lot of places and is being sold as sort of side by side with CBD. Has some psychoactive properties, but essentially THC9, or THC in general, is the shorthand for the psychoactive substance in cannabis that we are often talking about. Individual reactions with marijuana or cannabis are quite varied. It does have a strange phenomenon where many people will not experience psychoactive effects the first or second time they use the drug, which is kind of unique amongst a lot of substances that I'm aware of. But generally speaking, we associate use with some positive aspects like euphoria. Other people will have paranoia, mood swings, mild hallucinations, although it's quite, I think calling them hallucinations may be a little bit of a misnomer as well. But certainly some people do experience hallucinations under especially heavy doses of THC, and reduced concentration, distractibility, that kind of thing. Traditional dependence and withdrawal are uncommon in cannabis, meaning physiological dependence. There's not a really strong physiological withdrawal syndrome associated with cannabis. There is some behavioral dependence, of course, and there's certainly a withdrawal syndrome that seems to be more psychological in nature, but it doesn't seem to have a similar withdrawal syndrome or dependence like you see with alcohol, nicotine, or with opiates. So the hallucinogens related, but not the same, obviously, as cannabis, are a group of drugs that alter sensory perception, essentially seeing or hearing things that are not present. So hallucinations can be in anything that you have a human sense for, you can have a hallucination. So an auditory hallucination, a visual hallucination. These are the two most common we typically think of, but there are olfactory hallucinations where you'll smell something that's not there. There are tactile hallucinations where you'll feel something on your skin that's not there as well. And so all of your senses can be involved in hallucinations, but typically we're talking about visual and auditory hallucinations, visual being the most common hallucinations associated with these drugs. Those hallucinations at higher doses in the wrong context, just due to its interaction with that individual's psychology, can sometimes produce delusions, paranoia, agitation, psychosis, so to speak. Examples of hallucinogens include LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, which was derived in the 30s by Albert Hofmann accidentally. So there's synthetics. PCP, phencyclidine, is a very dangerous and powerful hallucinogen, which really kind of had its heyday mostly in the 60s and 70s, sometimes in the 80s, has sort of fallen out of favor, but you see it crop up every once in a while under different names and being utilized in other ways. Tolerance to these drugs builds quickly but resets after a very brief period of abstinence. So strangely enough, it's the idea that when they were doing a lot of research on LSD, especially in the 60s and 70s at places like Stanford and Harvard, what they found was that you could not immediately dose someone and get a similar effect with LSD, but that you wait a day or two and that person would have a similar reaction to the same dosage. So it doesn't seem to follow the same typical pattern of sort of a curved line that you associate with a lot of other drugs. As I mentioned, a lot of these drugs are derived from naturally occurring substances, like the same way that cannabis is. So psilocybin coming from certain types of mushrooms, mescaline coming from the peyote plant, which grows in a lot of desert regions, especially in the southwest of the United States. And then, of course, you have LSD, PCP, and a whole host of other synthetic hallucinogens, drugs like DMT and other types of chemically derived hallucinogenics. Finally, we'll talk about sort of some others, ones that don't fit into any of these categories. Inhalants. This is a drug that's, I think, is a drug of opportunity for a lot of adolescents. People who don't have access to other drugs will sometimes abuse inhalants. This is a very, very dangerous drug habit. I would highly recommend, as much as I'm not going to, sort of lecture to you about whether or not you choose to use some of these drugs. That's your own personal freedom. What I will say is that this is a very dangerous and damaging thing to do. Essentially, people had discovered that certain volatile solvents, some of which are present in things like spray paint and model glues and other chemicals, could be absorbed through the lungs by breathing them in directly. Hairspray, paint thinner, gasoline is nitrous oxide, or commonly known as whippets. All of which have a very high profile for causing what's called anoxia in the brain, which is, cutting off the oxygen to your brain and killing neurons. The effect of someone who is using inhalants is similar to someone who's intoxicated on alcohol, problems with motor coordination, that kind of thing. It produces tolerance and prolonged withdrawal syndromes and has extremely negative effects on both the brain and several other organ systems in the body. Fortunately, inhalants are not very common compared to some other drugs, but they certainly are a problem, especially in certain regions or certain sort of peer groups. They'll pop up and become something that's used and sort of rediscovered every now and then. But there's a reason why some of these chemicals that have commercial uses are strictly regulated or kept behind the counter or locked up, that kind of thing. Sometimes it's because of the abuse potential. Anabolic and androgenic steroids are basically drugs that are derived or synthesized from testosterone. They are used medically to increase body mass, and sometimes appropriately so. People that have extreme difficulty with wasting disease or can't gain weight. There's no associated high, but the dependence of these drugs is associated with wanting to maintain the effects of the substance. So there's kind of an interesting overlap sometimes with body dysmorphic disorder and the use of these. So of course, athletes, bodybuilders, people who are, obviously overly concerned about a certain archetype or sort of example of masculinity will sometimes be seeking, certain types of increased muscle mass, and they may not be physiologically inclined to build that type of muscle, so they will turn to anabolic or androgenic steroids to do so. They can have some really negative long-term impacts on your mood. They cause a lot of depression. They cause a lot of irritability and aggression. They cause a lot of damage to various organ systems as well. Um, your book kind of categorizes so-called designer drugs as an other class as well. These were originally produced by pharmaceutical companies to target certain diseases, and then others began producing them for recreational use. Interestingly enough, when I was a kid, my brother is significantly older than I am. 8.5, 9 years older than I am. And I remember him saying that when he was going to clubs in Houston in the mid 80s, ecstasy was legal. MDMA was legal, and there would be jars of, fish bowls full of ecstasy at the front of a club when you walked in, on display, and people were just kind of popping them as they wished. But MDMA was originally utilized as a drug used in therapy, interestingly enough, especially in couples therapy. And we are now, interestingly, seeing a resurgence in research of a lot of hallucinogenic and so-called designer drugs to treat a number of problems with really good evidence coming out. So even the VA is doing some research on this, where they are treating things like PTSD with MDMA and with psilocybin mushrooms and even LSD. And so there's some interesting research going on, but essentially these drugs really sprung out of club culture, what we now call EDM, what these call house music. There was sort of this association with taking these drugs to have that intense euphoric and hallucinogenic effect, dissociating in the midst of dancing, being part of sort of a social process of being involved in loud and exciting music in the setting. So ecstasy is the street name for MDMA. There are some chemical varieties as well, but Molly is what this kind of came to be called over the last several years, was sort of a resurgence of ecstasy under a different name. And this happens a lot with illicit drugs. They'll sort of come about, and then they'll go away for a little while. They'll become less popular, and then they resurge under a different name in a different context. And sort of with the growth of EDM, we kind of saw becoming this sort of much more mainstream, massive, popular style of music. We saw the increase of so-called Molly, which was just MDMA by different name. There are, as I said, many chemical variations. There's BD-MPEA, which is also called Nexus. Similar effects. There's ketamine, aka Special K, which is a tranquilizer, still used to this day in anesthesia. I recently had to have, a anesthesia for a screening procedure, and my anesthesiologist came in and said, "Oh, by the way, I gave you propofol and you were a little restless, so I gave you some ketamine and you settled right down." So it's still utilized in anesthesia quite a bit. It's also utilized in veterinary medicine as a tranquilizer. And then several years ago, going on probably 8 or 10 years ago, there was this outbreak of quote unquote bath salts, which is technically they're called the synthetic cathinones, but extremely similar in some ways to PCP, and caused some really high profile cases of people being, out of their minds. There was the very famous example of this guy under a bridge in Florida that bit the part of the face off of someone who was trying to help him. So we started associated these drugs with extreme disturbances in behavior and hallucination and confusion. But these are all sort of chemical substances. The human beings are infinitely creative when it comes to finding ways to get high, unfortunately, and for better or worse. But these are just examples of modern chemicals that there's been some psychoactive discoveries of their psychoactive properties, and therefore they end up being used in a variety of ways recreationally, sometimes with very negative side effects. So the million-dollar question in the addictions and the substance abuse dependence world of treatment is what causes these things. So we know that drugs have been with us as human beings for a long time. We know from family, twin, adoption, and other genetic studies that there is a genetic component for substance abuse, that the tendency to abuse substances, to engage in those unhealthy behaviors, acquiring, using, recovering from the drug, continuing to use despite impairment in functioning, there seems to be some genetic component that it does in fact run in families, so to speak. We know there's certain genetic studies that have been done on African American and Latino populations that show a specific gene associated with a risk for opiate or heroin abuse. This is just one example of a study. It probably holds across ethnicities, no doubt. But the idea is that there seems to be a strong genetic component for some forms of addiction of one form or another. So much of the focus, of course, has been on alcoholism because it is the most widespread. There seems to be differences in how we process and metabolize alcohol, which may have something to do with how we become addicted to alcohol, and may show certain differential outcomes of treatments for alcohol use disorder. But ultimately what it comes down to is we know multiple genes are involved in substance abuse. It is definitely polygenetic. There is no magic single gene that causes people to become addicted, and it is not by any means entirely genetic. It is highly influenced by individual psychology, by setting and environment. This is a nature and nurture phenomenon. There are some interesting research that's done on neurobiological influences. Basically, the way that your brain processes these drugs may have something to do with why you become addicted. So drugs affect the pleasure pathway of the brain, the reward center, really focused in the limbic system, the dopaminergic systems in the area, midbrain, frontal cortex as well. So when this is the part of your brain that gets activated or excited when you receive a reward, which could be food, could be sexual pleasure, could be praise, whatever it is, any form. We know that drugs may inhibit GABA, which is what is used it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, if you remember correctly. It's also involved in anxiety. But GABA essentially is the neurotransmitter that turns down the volume or turns off the reward pleasure system. So drugs that inhibit GABA tend to make it easier to get that sort of dopaminergic push in the brain. So drugs that inhibit neurotransmitters may produce anxiety, negative affect as well. So these are sort of some examples of how nicotine can affect various different neurotransmitters in the brain. Now, we know that it affects some specifically, but it affects dopamine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, glutamate, serotonin, beta endorphin, and GABA. So as you see from the arrows here, these are all involved in various different aspects of brain functioning, everything from pleasure and appetite suppression to anxiolytic effects, to modulating your mood, to learning and memory. So it's never a simple one-way street or simple pathway. There's often things are quite complex in how we're processing drugs in our brains. Now, the research that I did as a graduate student, my own personal research that formed my master's thesis and my dissertation, was really focused a lot on the psychological dimensions behind addiction, and not just addiction, but just substance use in general. I've always been interested in viewing this upon a continuum. I don't think that drugs are inherently bad or evil. I think that, obviously there's plenty of drugs that we're very fortunate that we are aware of, like painkillers when you're or anesthesia when you're in surgery. The ability to treat lots of different illnesses through different drugs that affect neurotransmitters. These are all boons to humanity, right? But there are ways in which we think about and relate to substances that can make it more likely that we're going to have a problem associated with those drugs versus being able to use them in moderation. We know that early on, a lot of drug use is essentially a positive reinforcement process in place. You're seeking euphoria or a high. Now, with some drugs, especially with things like heroin and opiates, there is a very strong association with chasing that high, so to speak, that the euphoria associated with use is never as intense as it is in the early first or second, third uses. So initial use is often chasing the euphoria. Later use is often more related to seeking to escape the withdrawal process. Now you've got the negative reinforcement. If you remember your behaviorism from your intro psych class, negative reinforcement is when you are removing something aversive, right? Something that's uncomfortable. So that's very different than punishment. Negative reinforcement is unrelated to the concept of punishment. So by using the drug, you're trying to avoid the aversive experience of crashing or going through withdrawal. Um, a huge part of our research and my research that was on drug use is coping. How do people use drugs in an attempt to cope with their psychological suffering, whether it's depression, anxiety, how do they use drugs to cope with negative affect? So this process of self-medication or tension reduction. And I think many people that are undergoing problems with substances will point out that there are other stressors in their life that are going on, relationships, financial, whatever, that they are seeking to escape from or avoid by use of substances. So that, drugs as a means of coping is a really fascinating area of research as well. There is what's something called the opponent process theory, which that says that the drugs themselves are the easiest way to alleviate the feelings of withdrawal. So as I said, rather than other means of coping, the drugs are a quick fix to avoid the withdrawal. And certainly when you're in acute withdrawal and you're extremely uncomfortable or sick, or it's very aversive, like things like heroin or alcohol withdrawal, it's an extremely powerful pull psychologically to want to end that suffering by taking the substance, which will turn off that process. Um, One of the things I looked at a lot in my research was motivation and expectancy. So what expectancy is a cognitive phenomenon of, what do I expect to happen as a result of X, Y, or Z being done? So people are using drugs when they are anticipating or expecting positive effects. It's going to help me to be more social and less nervous in social situations. It's going to help me to relax, to dance, it's going to help me feel less depressed. It's going to help me feel less pain, so this idea that you are anticipating or expecting a positive effect plays a big role in whether or not you continue to or decide to use a drug. And then cravings, a desire for the drug, a feeling that you quote unquote need the drug because of your mood, your environment, the availability of it. A lot of the substance abuse treatment world will talk about people, places, and things, right? People in recovery will say, I need to focus on people, places, and things. What they're talking about is I need to avoid cues, psychological triggers for me to use certain people, certain types of people, certain environments, certain places. For example, some alcoholics will say, well, I can't go to a bar. If I go to a bar, I'm going to be too tempted to drink. I can't go to a family gathering where I know everyone's going to be drunk, that kind of thing. Certain people that I used to use with are going to encourage me because they're still using. So these are all factors to consider in terms of maintaining or getting over addiction. So there's a cognitive behavioral explanation that I really focused on a lot too. This idea that drugs are behavioral reinforcers. If you are anxious and you take a drug like, for example, Valium, you are going to see reduction in your anxiety. That is a very strong behavioral reinforcement to do that again when you feel anxious. You are forming a link sort of through operant conditioning that says that, the result, the consequence of this is that, and therefore I want to pursue it. There are those learned expectations I mentioned. So there's a longitudinal study of adolescent drinking that says that those that expect social benefits drink more and endorse more positive social benefits to alcohol. There's a confirmation bias there. Excuse me. Many people who have social anxiety or feel nervous say, well, I'll have a couple drinks and then I'll relax and then I'll be more gregarious or extroverted. So they tend to drink more because you're chasing that effect. And then, of course, there's this classical conditioning, generally just associating the use of the substance with the pleasant feeling or the activities that you're engaged with others while you're using. So simply just pairing those two things together in the brain through a classical conditioning process. As I mentioned, expectancy is sort of that anticipation of a systematic relationship between the events or the objects, in this case, the drug, in an upcoming situation. So thinking that alcohol is a tension reducing or a social lubricant, thinking that I'll be able to focus on studying if I drink 4 cups of coffee or smoke a cigarette or use nicotine in some other form. These are your beliefs. These are the things you believe about the beneficial effects of drug use. So it can enhance me in a perceptual or physical way. It will alleviate negative affect. These are all the things that we form in our brain about what's going to happen if I do this thing. One of the things I focused on in my research was the idea of motivation, which is related to expectancy, but it's not quite the same construct. What I sort of focused on was that drug use is purposeful. People who abuse drugs are not necessarily stupid or ignorant. I mean, the idea is that we when we engage in a behavior, we generally have a purpose in mind. So we're seeking to achieve a desired outcome or to avoid an undesired outcome, that negative reinforcement process, like with withdrawal. So my research focused on this idea that people are really utilizing for a variety of different types of motives, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is just kind of the general model that I utilized in my research. So we've got two different axes that are crossed here. We've got sort of the internal versus external axis, and then we've got the negative versus positive axis. So the idea being that internal is really about the internal psychology, what's going on within your brain. On the negative side of the internal axis, what you're looking at is I want to cope with something internal, negative affect, depression, anxiety. So I'm going to use drug X to have result Y on my ability to cope with whatever thing I'm struggling with. On the positive side of that internal spectrum, you've got the idea of enhancement, and this might be the idea that, if I use this drug, I'll be better at this thing. I'll be more able to do a certain thing. So these are related mirror images of each other. On the external side, on the negative side of motivation, you see things like conformity. Well, all of my friends drink. If I don't drink, I'll be isolated or alienated. Everyone I know likes to get together and use this drug, and therefore, if I don't do that, then I'm going to be outcast from that group, or I might not feel connected in the same way everyone else does. Flip side of that, the positive aspect of an external motivation is social motivation. I have more fun at the football game if I drink as opposed to if I don't. I will have a better time at this party if I smoke pot or whatever. So the idea is that these motivations are unique to individuals, but they have certain dimensions that are universal, and that we often use drugs for these specific reasons. So given the length of the video at this point, I'm going to go ahead and cut things off here as part 1, and I will come back with part 2 briefly, and we'll talk about social and cultural dimensions and move further into treatment of substance use disorders, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about other impulse control disorders. So I'll see you for part 2.